And Susan, I'd like to start with Wally's connection to the original way this was published and the illustrations that go with that, because it's very interesting to see these. And it was banned in a number of New England libraries for the racy illustration. So we'll just step into how that was done to enhance the first publication of this Eve's Diary.
Okay, well, I am going then to be sharing my screen right now. And again, I keep saying the same thing, but thank you for your patience, because a lot of this is set up ahead of time sometimes. Now, can everybody see a screen that says Eve's Diary by Mark Twain? Okay. So Linda, if you want to navigate it with me, I can show you I can scroll down and we can look at some of the illustrations that you're talking about. And if you want to just tell me when to stop.
All right, let's start with this one. I think we showed some classic illustrations from historic art in the first session that were actually quite similar to this type of thing. The tree and the two nude figures cleverly disguised with fig leaves or whatever to introduce the illustration. I think what we should do, since there are quite a few, is scroll slowly through them and give, say, 5 seconds on each one or so for people to absorb them, and then ask for comments about what are you seeing? How does it strike you, the mood or the style of these illustrations as a fit for the text that you read? And as you can see, we're starting with the actual Eve's waking up, realizing I am a new creature, and that's that one. She's an experiment, that beginning idea. How everything looks. So the mountains were left raggedy, and here are a few animals. Another, the world as Eve first sees it. Stars are good too, and there's a whole long passage about Eve's attempt to catch stars and bring them down and chase them to the horizon and find out that they're actually far away. Hugging the tigers, getting scratched and voluntarily deciding, well, I won't do that again. Now we see Adam for the first time. The other being, I was afraid of it at first and started to run. Every time I turned around, there he was. But then it turns out that Adam is the one who's running away. So Adam's first instinct is to run away from Eve. And so then back to the stars idea. And now Adam is seriously running away. She loves to talk, and all her talking is more than he can take. Okay, let's pause here and get some first impressions from what you see in these illustrations. Who has some comments about the style and the way the illustrations feel?
Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Well, it makes the people feel so insignificant in contrast to the trees around them. They're so tiny. They're just a little piece of nature.
Tremendous observation. They're tiny, in every single illustration has this gigantic world into which these two tiny figures are placed. So in this particular illustration, they've at least settled down enough for her to give him a name and the possessive hisn. I'll consider it a man and call it he until he turns out to be something else. So we notice who's doing all the naming in this story, even though the Bible says it was the man. And now they actually look like they're having a conversation.
Know if Mark Twain was left-handed?
Do we know that?
Well, he says that Eve was left-handed. She said she was left-handed.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if in 1904 there was already an idea that left-handed people are more artistic. That is something that has been suggested. The dinosaur appears.
Used for a bridge.
What?
She wanted to use it for.
Maybe that was supposed to be a dodo. I don't know. Then my first sorrow. I wanted to talk to him. I thought it was some mistake, for I loved to be with him and loved to hear him talk. So I went away and sat lonely in a place where I first saw him in the morning that we were made, and I did not know what he was and was indifferent about him. But now it was a mournful place, and every little thing spoke of him. So they're starting to experience loneliness because there's a possibility of being with someone else. You can't know that you're lonely if you've never had a companion. You can't know loneliness unless you know the opposite. And so Twain is very skillfully bringing this story together, showing them becoming dependent. Lonesomeness emphasized again. Remember that the whole story of woman's creation starts with God's decision that it is not good for man to be alone. So loneliness is the genesis of the creation story in Genesis 2. Loneliness kicks off the whole sequence of God's action. So Twain is picking up that theme as he is telling an emotional story, not just using domestic humor or making a joke of placing this in the Garden of Eden, in Niagara Falls, and all those interesting sidelights, but the way he's telling the story. And again, what Sue said about that gigantic illustration with all this proportion of the people being so small. Okay. And then this is the illustration that was chosen for the cover of one of the editions of Eve's Diary. And it shows the narcissistic Eve being very, very self-aware, gazing at her reflection in the pool, and that gives a lot of artistic possibility to the water and the reflection. Does anybody want to comment? Anybody with a little art background want to comment on how these are produced? I believe they're pen and ink. they're just pen and ink drawings. And I think that the black and white is very fitting and very dramatic. Of course, the only alternative, I think, in 1904 would have been hand-colored illustrations like some publications had, but that would be another whole dimension of cost. But I think the black and white is used beautifully in these.
Could they be etchings?
Yes, they could be, couldn't they, Shar? Yeah, that could be. I should have looked this up.
I tried.
And now we get these reflections of Adam. Perhaps I ought to remember that she is very young. So he's thinking about Eve's limits. She makes friends with the Brontosaurus. So that has lots of possibilities for very cool illustrations. Now this Brontosaurus is starting to be equal in proportion to the size of the drawing. Again, loneliness is being emphasized over as one of his themes. I had to have his company. I was made for it. So I made friends with the animals. And then she, just as the animals were created first, and then God realizes the man is still lonely when he has the animals, Eve is going through this relationship too of realizing, yes, the animals can be companions in a way, but she's still lonesome. I love that illustration with the zebras looking up like that. Or giraffes, I'm sorry, giraffes. Elephant.
May I make a comment here too, please?
Yes, Wally, you had some interesting comments in your email too. Go
Sounds
ahead.
like very, very interesting that Eve is very much of an experimentalist. She wanted to find out how these dinosaurs behave, using that as a tool to cross the river. I thought that's very clever of her to think that way. So she's more adventuresome too.
Adventuresome, experimenting. I mean, of the two of them, she is definitely the scientist, isn't she, Wally?
Yes, yes, she's an inquisitive mind.
Yes. You had some other comments in the message that you sent me about these two.
Yes.
And a little bit about your feelings on that.
Yes. Well, you go ahead and read it. I don't have it with me in front of me here.
I can pull it up if you want, Linda.
Okay. All right. Let's finish the illustrations first and then go back to Wally's comments that were interpreting the whole story. So again, we have Eve here. By experiment, I know that wood swims, and dry leaves and feathers and plenty of other things. Therefore, by all the cumulative evidence, you know that a rock will swim. Of course, she's wrong about that. But you have to put up with simply knowing it, for there isn't any way to prove it up to now. But I shall find a way. Then that excitement will go. Such things make me sad.
Not it. Yeah.
So she's forming hypotheses and testing them as she is able to do so. That's a beautiful drawing there. The garden is lost. So now this is quite a touching and dramatic thing too. And Adam and Eve are now completely dependent on each other and thinking about what the other means to him. And then Eve has this very long sort of soliloquy about why she loves Adam. And she's saying there really is no reason that I love him except that he's masculine. And I didn't make my sex and he didn't make his, so she's not going to blame him for anything either. At the bottom, he is good and I love him for that. But I could love him without it. I would love him even if he isn't, if he should beat me and abuse me, I should go on loving him. I want to come back to that statement and ask how you all feel about that in 1904. I know it. It is a matter of sex, I think. Why does Twain go to the level of having Eve say this? He is strong. I should go on loving him even if he beat me. She's not saying that he does beat her, but that's a very powerful thought of hers. He is strong and handsome and I love him for that.
But how did she know what beating was?
Exactly. Exactly. I love him merely because he is mine and is masculine. It's like a stand by your man. You know, it's just creating this myth of the unshakable, nothing ever could possibly stand in the way. There is no other reason, okay? And that one has a lot of motion in that one. It's very ethereal, sort of very glorious. And here she hopes to go first. It's her prayer that she will be the first to die. For he is strong, I am weak. I am not so necessary to him as he is to me. Now that's a powerful statement too. Life without him would not be life. How could I endure it? This prayer is also immortal and will not cease from being offered up while my race continues. I am the first wife, and in the last wife I shall be repeated. And then that powerful closing where Adam's last line is, wherever Eve was, there was Eden. Are there any other overall comments on the illustrations?
I thought they were really beautiful.
Oh, I do too. I really, really like them very much. In a way, they're extremely innocent. It's hard to believe that this book was banned in libraries anyway. I mean, we have to remember that in general, it wasn't banned. It was only very exceptional that somebody in 1904 wouldn't be able to deal with these illustrations of this. How many times had nudes been used for biblical subjects before, you know, in every century you can name? And you sort of forget that they're nude. I mean, do you agree with me that as you get into the book, it's just part of the illustration as a whole? It becomes sort of incidental that they're nudes at all.
They don't really look salacious. They look so innocent. I mean, the way they're depicted. So it's hard to get that perspective.
Yeah. If you're looking for pornography, you're going to find it somewhere else, you know, then and now. This isn't real.
They come on as just shapes.
Yeah.
But I love how graceful and flowing most of the depictions of Eve are, that she's in action. She is with her hair flowing and her limbs very graceful.
That is so true. And when we go back to those older images, those classic images of Adam and Eve, they're standing there stiff as a board beside the tree. They're just posed like a portrait or something. And almost every one of these artistic illustrations, as Anne just said, is in motion. The characters are in motion and something is happening. So they have it's both art and it really supports the story.
I have a comment in chat. Did we notice Eve had a belly button?
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
Did you want me to read Wally's comments?
Yes.
The online version of the book with racy illustrations separated Eve's perspectives from Adam's. Twain did a marvelous job describing Eve as a sensitive, talkative, and curious woman. Adam, on the other hand, was moody and needy. He tolerated the extrovert Eve's inquisitive nature. He was the 19th century grumpy old man. Twain was an observant author. Did he hide his feelings towards Olivia?
Okay. Terrific questions. Those of you who read the extra material in the book that you read learned a little bit more about Olivia, what we know about her, and the fact that she had died somewhat, not a long time before he did this. Did he hide his feelings toward Olivia? Well, he's trying to portray a universal story. So I wonder now if you'd like to, Susan, go to the last slide that we covered last time, which I think was number 29 or 30. Or I guess I can do that. Now we go to the PowerPoint.
Yes. And while you're doing that, Ken has commented, or asked the question, has anyone heard the musical, The Apple Tree? It is based on Twain's writing.
No.
I have not.
Ken, if you'd like to unmute, if you're not comfortable doing that, but if you'd like to unmute and comment on that while she's opening her PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's Lorma, actually. It's Lorma
Oh.
Freestone and Pat Williams. We're listening together.
Awesome.
And yeah, and it's Jerry Bach and Sheldon Herrick, and it was out in the 60s. As a matter of fact, Hope College put it on in the 70s. But it was it's a wonderful, wonderful musical, and it's 3 stories, and one of them is the Diary of Adam and Eve, and the other one is Lady and the Tiger, and the other one is Cinderella. But the Diary of Adam and Eve, if you look it up on YouTube, just look for it and listen to the music. Especially the words are all based on Twain, and it's just, the songs are hysterical and they're just marvelous. So anyway, I recommend it highly.
Good. I will look into that.
Yeah. Hi, Wally.
Okay. All right, looking back now at the slides that we looked at last week, we again see that this artist also from, the 1700s or 1800s placed enormous, huge background with the figures very tiny. So the fact that Sue realized how tiny the figures are in the whole picture is part of the artistic tradition too. Oh, now, Susan, I can't advance it myself. Here. Oh,
Okay,
wait.
so what you're going to want to do is click into your PowerPoint, and that will make that live, and then you can, yeah.
All right, here
Well-
again, an enormous amount of sky, and then the animals very small. And now let's take a look at a couple of passages that struck me as significant. And let me see now. Her passage about why do I love Adam, which in my copy is pages. Now, can you see this large enough to see the printing?
With difficulty, yes.
Susan, do you have any way to?
Sure, let me
You
work.
can enlarge it by drawing it up on your screen and spreading it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's page 69 in the book from,
Oh, thank you. Now good. That gives us a good translation to where it is in your books, page 69. Yeah, I can do that too. And in my book, it's page 21. Oh, excuse me, this isn't where, this is the Long Tuesday monologue, okay. After the fall, Eve's diary, why do I love him? Now do we have a page reference? This is
Well,
in,
I'll read what I have. If I ask myself why I love him, I find I do not know, do not really care much to know. So I suppose that this kind of love is not a product of reasoning and statistics, like one's love for other reptiles and animals. I think this might be so. Is that what you're looking at? Do you want to?
yeah,
And that's what's on page 69. It's the third paragraph.
okay, page 69 for those of you following it in the book. And then maybe you can get it big enough on the screen if you don't have your book in front of you, that you can read it from here. Now, how many of you know the old phrase from French, which goes way back, la cœur a ses raisons qu'il a la raison ne connaît pas. The heart has its reasons which reason does not know. The heart has its reasons which reason does not know. It's an old French saying, already current in Twain's time. So the idea there of what we today would call unconditional love, or sort of the mystery of what is behind love, where you don't need to go through an enumeration. Oh, he's handsome, he's, tall, he's got beautiful eyes, and da-da-da-da-da, and he's so accomplished, and my family likes him, and we have so much in common. All of these are the reasons. And then the underlying old French saying, le cœur a raison qui la raison ne connaît pas, is the idea here. So did you like this passage? In this is kind of a very long soliloquy, as Eve is saying much more than either one of them were saying at the beginning of these excerpts. So both characters are having longer passages now. So let me hear some comments about this.
Well, she's really talking about why she loves the birds because of their singing, but she said, I don't really love him because of singing. Actually, he doesn't sing very well at all. And it's just kind of the comparison of why she loves some things. And she said, but that doesn't matter because I love him anyway. It's kind of, and she gives a bunch of different things here. It's not account of his brightness, I love him. It's not account of his gracious and considerable ways and delicacy, I love him. Not account of his industry. She just kind of goes on and on. Not account of his education, not his chivalry. I think merely because he's masculine, I love him. So anyway.
All right.
Bottom, he is good. I love him for that. But I still could love him without it. If he should beat me and abuse me, I should go on loving him. I know it. It is a matter of sex, I think. Okay.
All right. Now, I loved this whole thing right up until the part about if he should beat me, I would still love him, because as we all know, spousal abuse is an enormous problem in society from time to time. And the idea that you have a right to beat your wife has been defended from the Bible and many other religions for a very long time, and still is at times.
Isn't that an Anglo-Saxon practice that Henry VIII said you can beat your wife by the rule of thumb, because you can only beat her with a stick that is about the size of thickness of your thumb?
Well, Henry VIII didn't stop with beating his wives. He's got
Why, he
rid of
executed them.
that's all.
He's a misogynist.
Have you ever heard the paradoxical statement, it's hard to beat a working wife? On the one hand, it's a big advantage, but on the other hand, she has her own source of income. So What is Twain doing here? Is it possible that when she says, I would even love him if he beat me, that we're showing fallen Eve? Remember how we said that when they start blaming each other, that was after the fall, that Adam started saying, well, I'm the big man now, I'm going to supervise. Whereas he didn't have that need to overpower her before the fall. So man's sense of superiority and I'm the boss came about because of the fall. And so this would be a way in which Eve too is subject to the fall, so that her love for him even extends to something that society is not going to bless or see as ideal at all. It's just terrible. And even by 1904, there were state laws and federal laws that punished spousal abuse, and it could be used in some states by 1904 as a reason for divorce, although in other states, spousal abuse was not yet a reason for divorce, regardless of how severe it was not legally a justification for divorce. Let's hear a little more comment on that.
Well, you rightly pointed out last week that Twain made his reputation as being a satirical comic. And yet we take lines like this as if he's expressing some kind of personal philosophy. I mean, maybe it's a laugh line.
And it could be a laugh line. I think that's very insightful. And if this, this whole thing is so theatrical to me, I'm not surprised that there's a whole musical made of it, or that theater departments have attempted to present this on stage, because the lines and the paragraphs deliver very easily when an actor takes up to represent this. I could see any number of actors getting a lot of laugh lines out of this.
That whole soliloquy about he's not this, he's not that, he's not the other thing. I mean, it's hilarious in terms of who this guy is, right? He has no redeeming virtues. He's an oaf. He's a bumbler. I could imagine the crowd laughing very, very uproariously, and the actor taking his time and delivering those lines.
I wonder if you think that if a woman says, well, it's not because of his wonderful education that I love him, are you implying that he does have a wonderful education, but that's not why you love him? And he is tall and handsome, but that's not why you love him. So is she pointing to that he doesn't have any of these things? In other words, he's a sort of a clumsy oaf, but she loves him anyway? Or do you think it's possible that this could be delivered like it's a laugh line, that she's noticing all these things and they are of value to her, but she's still expressing this idea that she's not just looking for a checklist?
It's the wonderful part of the theater. The actor gets to make the interpretation, right?
A lot with it.
Well, I think that last paragraph just before the end, she said, yes, I think I love him merely because he is mine and is masculine. There's no other reason, I suppose. And so I think it is, as I first said, that this kind of love is not a product of reasoning and statistics. It just comes.
Right.
None knows whence and cannot explain itself and doesn't need to. And then she says, it's what I think, but I am only a girl and the first that has examined this matter. And it may turn out that in my ignorance and inexperience, I have not got it right. So I think that conclusion is pretty interesting. It's
very interesting, especially since she didn't pick him out of the crowd. He's the only candidate here. He doesn't have any competition, according, if you take the idea of this is the original one. So she really doesn't, she didn't pick him out of any group.
I just imagine Carol Burnett delivering these lines.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. All right, let's move to another selection. Let's see now. Okay, now Eve is the one who discovers fire. So she's still the great scientist, but she stumbles upon fire. Now, how many great inventions have been stumbled upon while the inventor or scientist was looking for something else? That's not what he was concentrating on, and all of a sudden, he notices something that's way more important than what he was looking for in the first place. Or inventors who went through an incredible number of failed experiments, like Morse and the telegraph, or the invention of other things that ended up extremely important, but were discovered on the way to trying to find out something else. So experiment does Eve realize the significance of fire?
No.
Think of it as just something pretty but useless, I think. Fire is beautiful. Someday it will be useful. So it's primarily beautiful, but she thinks someday it will be useful somehow. And we're laughing because, you know, the discovery of fire, the use of fire is considered a great landmark in the development of man.
There's also the destructive input of what fire is.
Yes.
Well, and she also cooks an apple. She doesn't think it does anything until she has an apple, gets cooked in it. And she said, oh, this even makes it even more delicious than it was before. So she said the first applesauce.
Now we have applesauce and baked apples already on the menu. Yep, discovers that it's really good. What does Adam think of fire? I guess we don't really find out about that.
I thought he was the first to find all the apples that were cooked on the ground and really liked them. And then later Eve discovered the same thing.
That's interesting, Shar. That's an interesting comment. I think you're right, that maybe we have a case where they're both claiming to have been the one who discovered the apples. And of course, the apples come into the narrative so many different times. The first time Twain says apple, people are laughing because they're expecting to see the apple be the source of all their troubles. And then every time they refer to apples, not all apples are bad, because most, you know, only the one apple came from the forbidden tree. The rest of the apple trees are all fine, I suppose. On toward the end, right, the last paragraph before extract from Adam's diary, I saw him again for a moment last Monday at nightfall, but only for a moment. I was hoping he would praise me for trying to improve the estate, for I had meant well and had worked hard. But he was not pleased and turned away and left me. He was also displeased on another account. I tried once more to persuade him to stop going over the falls. That was because the fire had revealed to me a new passion, quite new and distinctly different from love, grief, and those others which I had already discovered. Fear, and it is horrible. I wish I had never discovered it. Gives me dark moments, spoils my happiness. It makes me shiver and tremble and shudder. But I could not persuade him, for he has not discovered fear yet, and so he could not understand me. I wonder if Twain thinks of not only loneliness as something that's particularly human, that certainly animals can be lonely, and certainly animals can love their mates and can perish without their partners and mourn for the loss of their master as a dog can do. But animals don't feel loneliness the way that humans do. And perhaps that's true of fear as well. What's the difference between the instinct we think of animals having when they run from fire and human fears? Well, human beings can think up fears that don't exist, and probably animals can't do that. Although there's an old saying, a cat won't sit on a hot stove, but he won't sit on a cold one either. So a cat doesn't realize that what burned him was the hot stove and the cold stove is safe, whereas a human can perceive that. So maybe an animal can become paranoid, terribly afraid of things, but so can people. So think how much human misery comes from fears that are real, and a great deal of misery also coming from fears that are not real. Now they have differing attitudes toward the Brontosaurus. And the mere size of the Brontosaurus is a concern of Adam's. When the mighty Brontosaurus came striding into the camp, she regarded it as an acquisition. I considered it a calamity. That is a good sample of the lack of harmony that prevails in our views of things. She wanted to domesticate it. I wanted to make it a present of the homestead and move out. So I wanted to, in other words, give the Brontosaurus the whole garden and get out of here. It could be tamed by kind treatment and would be a good pet. I said a pet 21 feet high and 84 feet long would be no proper thing to have about the place, because even with the best intentions and without meaning any harm, it could sit down on the house and mash it, or anyone could see by the look of its eye that it was absent-minded. That's a laugh line right there. That's very good. What was the comment that I just heard? Someone. You have Adam complaining that Eve is never satisfied. Now, he does sound like what Wally said, just a grumpy old man, a constant complainer. He's complaining about Eve in that paragraph. He's saying we have different views of Brontosaurus, but he's also saying we have different views and I'm right and she's wrong, isn't he? And then the last paragraph in that section, was she satisfied now? No, nothing ever satisfies her but demonstration. Untested theories are not in her line and she won't have them. It is the right spirit, I concede it. It attracts me. I feel the influence of this scientific attitude she has. If I were with her more, I think I should take it up myself. Well, she had one theory remaining about this colossus, meaning the Brontosaurus. She thought if we could tame it and make him friendly, we could stand in the river and use him for a bridge. It turned out that he was already plenty tame enough, at least as far as she was concerned. So she tried her theory, but it failed. Every time she got him properly placed in the river and went ashore to cross over him, he came out and followed her around like a pet mountain, like the other animals. They all do that. So complaining that all the animals follow Eve around. We have such a picture of her as sort of the mother of all, mothering and nurturing toward the animals and loved by all of the animals. So the mythical idea that she's the mother of all creation is elaborated on with his typical comic touch.
He thinks she talks too much.
Yeah.
That's mentioned several times.
Yes, always talking. But he does say at times that he likes to hear her talk.
Right.
And she says that she likes to hear him talk. And then his loneliness at the end is very profound because it's very, very quiet where Adam ends the book. So here's the very ending that I believe you have in your book as well, as Eve's prayer that she will be the last to go. And the prayer begins like this: "It is my prayer, it is my longing that we may pass from this life together, a longing which shall never perish from the earth, but shall have place in the heart of every wife that loves until the end of time, and it shall be called by my name. But if one of us must go first, it is my prayer that it shall be I, for he is strong, I am weak. I am not so necessary to him as he is to me. Life without him would not be life. How could I endure it? This prayer is also immortal and will not cease from being offered up while my race continues. I am the first wife, and in the last wife I shall be repeated." Now, this is really beautiful prose. It's very beautiful, and it expresses many people's idea. And then but if the book ended there and didn't have Adam's wish at her grave, then this wouldn't be balanced with the two sides, because clearly in the illustration and this simple last line, Eve was everything to Adam. Wheresoever she was, there was Eden. It was everything he lost, everything he gave up, and everything he might miss in what had happened before. So the fall of man brought about this love story. It's almost implying that without human frailty, there couldn't be the reality of human love. Who wants to be in a perfect garden where there's never an argument, there's never any trouble, and there's never anything to overcome? There is never any fear or grief or loss. It's only in the presence of all that the human love that's being portrayed here becomes possible. So it's a kind of underscore of one way of looking at the blessed fall, the fact that it was a blessing to man that all of this evolved, the knowledge, the curiosity, and even the losses that Eden represents. And therefore the world is such a beautiful place because it is all passing away, and because we treasure what we have, because we know what it is like to have all these losses. So it ends, that takes the comedy of it to another level. So I want to go back a little bit to the idea of, in the end, as we saw this whole thing unfold, is Eve his ultimate completion and helper, and a help meet to his needs, as we were saying in the language of the old Hebrew text, that she is his heart and breath and soul, like that's what the rib represented, even though, or what? Or is she, in the end, for Twain in 1904, something deeper than that? Well, I think the ending of this is lyrical to me, a comic, but still comic, but lyrical in a way, pointing in so many directions. I had one more slide here. Here's some copy from the back cover of the edition that I have. Mark Twain's quote, and this is, back cover copy is always trying to sell the book to whatever reader might pick this up and just give a little thumbnail of what the book is. Mark Twain's translation of the Diaries of the First Man and Woman offers a humorous, he said, she said narrative of biblical events. The great American storyteller found comfort and inspiration in the company of women, and his irreverent look at conventional religion is also a thoughtful and humorous argument for gender equality. Now, there's an implication there that conventional religion is not an argument for gender equality, and that in order to present this picture of Adam and Eve that Mark has fashioned for your entertainment and inspiration. We have to be ripping up the Bible, narrative of biblical events, but make it humorous, go completely away from it, and completely abandon what the original story was or could be. I would like to suggest that Mark Twain captures an underlying reverence for this whole thing that we have to respect. That's part of the fact that this isn't just another scene of I Love Lucy. And it just isn't just another case of showing Adam jumping over the Niagara Falls as a comic takeoff on the Garden of Eden. That the whole thing, including the illustrations, have a sort of, first of all, love for human life, sense of the comedy, the human comedy. What do we mean when we say the human comedy? Sort of, a comedy has a happy ending. A comedy has something grand about it that is very human. So did he undertake this in order to take an irreverent look at conventional religion? Or did he latch onto something here that is universal in what he picked up and what he played with? And that the original Genesis story has its own elements of humor about it in the course of telling a story about the origination of man and woman.
It's a little off subject, but have you heard about what Mark Twain said about heaven and hell? The advantage, each has an advantage. Heaven for the climate, hell for the company.
All right, he's full of comical uses of the idea of hell. Do you remember the place in Huckleberry Finn where Huckleberry Finn is just being beleaguered by Ms. Watson? Sit up straight, Huckleberry, eat your blueberries, Huckleberry. And he says, she was always going on about heaven and hell, where I decided I wanted to go wherever she wasn't going to go. And then also in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, after he and Jim have this amazing interchange, he realizes that he loves Jim and he wants Jim to have freedom, and he's willing to break the law in order to help Jim have freedom. He says, well, I know I might be going to hell for what I did wrong helping Jim, but if that's what it costs, by golly, that's where I want to go, or something like that. He has that other joke like John's referring to about rejecting hell. How many of you listened to the rest of the Hal Holbrook narrative and looked for that segment that I mentioned last week where he does take up religion, and he has a long section in the old Evening with Mark Twain presentations that he used to do about religion, and what just making a number of some satirical and some serious comments about religious ideas. I think that we'll think about that as we go forward. But in this last quotation from the back of the book, an argument for gender equality. Now, how rare was that in 1904? Was anybody already arguing for gender equality in 1904? Well, it depends on what you mean by the mark of gender equality. But yes, from any time after, during the entire latter half of the 1800s in the United States, there was strong pressure for women to have more legal rights in the American system. And they did gradually gain them. And of course, in 1904, they were only 16 years away from winning the vote Women were allowed to vote beginning in 1920, but there were decades of protests and women's movements to seek greater equality in America that were taking our culture ahead of many others in their progress toward the laws we have today on gender equality.
They were suffragettes who were wanting women's suffrage. A lot of them.
Yes.
Probably a minority, but a lot of them.
Yes, many, many women, and particularly in England, the suffrage movement involved a lot of suffering. Women were going to jail and being force-fed and going on hunger strikes. I mean, really extreme acts of civil disobedience by women, to be jailed and to be harmed because they were seeking the right to vote and other rights, marches and so forth.
And Twain probably knew about that.
Yes, and Twain, both with respect to racism and with respect to women's rights, he did understand and ally himself with those movements. Certainly his Eve is not only a woman, but I think that you could use this image of Eve as a very American woman, sort of exemplifying the way that the American woman was going to turn out to be in the 20th century in many ways, just as capable of science as the man is, just as curious, just as experimental. Does Adam ever give credit to Eve for sheer intelligence?
There's one feminist theologian who says that Eve was the first theologian because she was the one who had the conversation with the snake.
Okay.
She had the dialogue.
All right.
So she was a theologian, first one.
More of a philosopher and more of a theologian, and that's why the snake went to her first, rather than the fact that she was so weak and vulnerable.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think his wife was very influential in his writing. She reviewed a lot of his writings with him and was very, very helpful. And then he had a lot of financial problems because he was always investing in things that failed. And even though he made a lot of money, he lost a lot of money. And at one point they had to go to Europe to live because they could only afford it there. So she was a strong person, and I think in that relationship in terms of keeping the family going and some other things. And he was often got into these investment schemes that totally did a nosedive and almost lost everything for them. And also I think with religion, losing his wife and two of his children were very devastating to him. And I think that really kind of lost some faith over that.
Good comments, terrific comments. He invested in some type of advanced teletype machine or something. He thought he was latching onto a machine of the future and it would be worth investing in. And as you said, other investments that he made that just really didn't work out. Mark Twain's house is open today, and I believe it's in Hartford.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you made this Hartford. Yes.
Yes. And but he did not. He made a lot of money, but he made a lot of money while he was able to do his own traveling around, giving his evenings with Mark Twain, the real Mark Twain doing that, because he could charge a lot for that. And if he could stand the stress of all that travel and repeatedly doing the same performance for years, just with certain variations, he could make probably more from that as a livelihood than from the actual sale of his books.
I was struck in the beginning of the book with the scene where Eve is contemplating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and kind of saying, I don't know what to do with this because I don't know what good means and I don't know what evil means. And I guess the only way I'm going to find out is to eat this thing. Such an innocent view of her decision to explore that. And in a certain sense, the rest of the book is the story of what she learned, right? What is good and evil.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so Twain, like John Milton, by the way, in Paradise Lost, places tremendous emphasis on man having will, by which man does make choices. And if man were not to have will, then it wouldn't mean anything to have a relationship with God. It would just be a puppet relationship. It has to be moral discernment. It has to be a capacity to make a moral choice, including to make the wrong choice. So in Milton's Paradise Lost, he has scenes before the fall where Eve begins saying to Adam, I want to go off on my own. She says that all in this iambic pentameter, 17th century rhymed poetry. So I didn't send you off into those highways and byways, but Eve makes her argument that she should go off by herself. And she says to Adam, if I can't go off by myself, then I can't make a moral choice. If I'm just depending on you to tell me what to do, then I'm not a moral agent. I can't be a good person without having my freedom. That's a very good argument, and it's been made throughout the ages. In fact, one of Milton's most famous treatises is called Areopagitica, and it's an argument against censorship, saying there's no such thing as a fugitive and cloistered virtue that never goes forth to meet its enemies, but slinks out of the race where the immortal garland is to be run for. If you leave the battle, you can't be, if you're never permitted to go into the battle, you can't make a moral choice. I'm sure every teenager in the world has used this argument with their parents to say, if you don't give me the car keys and the freedom to do what I want once in a while, I can't be a good person. You'll never let me make the right choice because I'll never have any choice at all. And so making that argument is a classic argument that man needs freedom in order to be able to make right choices. So Adam has been saying in Paradise Lost, you shouldn't leave me because I know what the dangers are, and you'll be in danger if you leave me. So she wins the argument. She goes off by herself, and sure enough, the serpent talks her into eating the apple. Then she comes back, and both Adam and Eve are punished. And now she says to him, why did you let me go off on my own? You were supposed to be in charge. So even Milton is using that comedy that can come from the before the fall, she said this, and after the fall, she said this. After the fall, she was shaming and blaming. And before the fall, she was making the legitimate argument that freedom is necessary in order to make a choice. And so Milton had exploited the comedy, that comic paradox, and theology has had to deal with that comic paradox. Does man have free will, or does he not have free will? Did God foresee the fall of man, or did he cause the fall of man? And so forth, all these arguments going back. So it's a comic element that's in scripture in the first place. It's in the book of Genesis. So all this talk about making a humorous mockery sort of the biblical events is a little off the mark, because the paradox that creates the comedy was there in the original story. Like, wasn't it a good thing that man ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Man has to have the knowledge of good and evil in order to be human. So eating of the apple was a good thing in a way. And how many of you are familiar with the myth of Prometheus from the Greek tradition? Prometheus was one of the favorite Greek stories of the 1900s. Prometheus stole fire from the gods. So Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. And so Prometheus, in a way, was the original giver of the elements of progress to mankind. And he was punished for that. He was chained to a rock and forced forever to, suffer for mankind. So in that way by being he who suffered for mankind. He's sort of a Christ figure in a way, in a Greek framework. And people loved the myth of Prometheus, and they saw Prometheus in everyone who had suffered for a cause or done something great for mankind. So Eve, by eating of the apple, in a way is stealing the element that's going to give her the knowledge that she needs to be able to continue to perceive and to, be human. So the comic is blended in with, there's an ultimate kind of comedy in this story that goes way beyond cute little jokes about Niagara Falls or daredevil feats that Adam is pulling off, or little jokes about what Eve can do with the apple. There is something about the story of the connection between the two of them and the way they talk and the way they think that becomes the ultimate, lasting story that will still be relevant. And I think that Eve, in a special way, is an American woman in 1904, representing where Twain saw that the culture out as a whole was moving toward greater recognition of women, toward greater gender equality, and toward less of the old picture of man being the male being the leader who would just keep his woman at home, trapped in a small sphere with very little power or development. How many of you have ever run across the famous book by Betty Friedan, published in 1963, called The Feminine Mystique? Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, was sketching what she felt had happened to women during the 1950s to limit and downgrade the possibility for women and try to teach women that their only source of happiness was marriage and the family, and that they should have no interest, no dimension, no exercise of their minds or their educations outside the home and having children. And Friedan is saying that a whole generation of women was in a way lost by this mystique that you could make your rearing of children in your home life your only purpose, and pleasing your husband your only purpose. And if you wandered away from that, then you were just denying your femininity in the most elemental way, and you could never be happy. So you get the idea what Friedan was doing. She's considered the mother of the modern feminist movement, although, as you all just pointed out, there were suffragettes and women seeking greater recognition in the culture all the way through the latter 1800s, and really long before that in the United States.
Well, picking up on that comment, you could really see that Eve, as characterized by Mark Twain, is kind of the emergence of the modern American woman.
Yeah.
And while she may play the foil or seem the weaker or the more innocent as the story begins, toward the end, she's the one that really provides more of the substance, more of the base of the family. The chemistry is there, but she's the one that's really allowed it all to come together. It's not unlike, whether you look at Burns and Allen, the great comedy duo, and the role that she would play,
yes,
for years, in terms of being the kind of the silly foil for George Burns, but in the end, she was the smarter of the two. And same with Edith Bunker with Archie.
All right, that's a great comment. And when I mentioned this to my sister-in-law, we were talking about Lucy and Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and I love Lucy. And Eileen said, well, Lucy was usually right. Lucy was usually right in all their silly arguments. So maybe the idea that Twain is showing the husband being a little bit clueless and the woman being the one who's usually right is a comic idea. And then it was picked up in these other domestic comedy that figures that we have, Archie, Bunker, and Alice, and Lucy and Desi.
Yeah, you could see Burns and Allen just doing a stand-up routine, playing these roles.
Exactly. Yeah, that exactly. The elements of the comedy are there. You could also go back to Shakespeare plays, some of the Shakespeare romantic comedies, and see the woman, you know, the same relationship shown where the woman is showing her intelligence and her perception, and the man is kind of left out of the picture. There are even some old folk tales. There's an old folk tale about the man who says to the woman, very old German folk tale, well, you never do anything. You're just at home. Your life is so easy. I'm the one who has to go out and figure out how to do all these things. And she said, well, all right, I'll tell you what, we'll switch roles for a day. I'll go out and you do your work and you stay home and do my work. And of course, it's hilarious. The man can't figure out anything about how to do the work that she does or manage to carry the load that she carries. And she kind of knows what to do out there with his work. So folklore has been giving us this comic inversion of gender roles for a long time to present the woman as smarter than she's made out to be sometimes.
I made a few comments on chat.
Oh, good. Let's see. I can't access chat. Susan, are you there? Maybe I can. Let's see if I have chat here. Well, would you repeat what you said in chat, please? I don't think I have somehow. Maybe if I do stop share, I'll be able to. There, now I can see the chat. No, I don't have it. Was that Suzanne? Who said that you had comments in chat? I'm sorry, I can't see the chat, and I think Susan isn't with us right now. So if you would, can anybody see the chat?
It was me. I tried to start and then they cut me out. So she muted me. So I couldn't say what I had said.
Okay. All right, give us what you had to say. Yes.
Okay, hang on one moment, please. I perceive that Twain's depiction of Eve was an allegory of his relationship with his wife, their relationship. And procreation for human beings did not begin before the fall. Did God's creation of woman have this in his plan? And Wyoming Suffrage Act of 1869, but it was still a territory at that time.
Okay. New Jersey, before it was a state, also had voting for women. So some states had very early permission for women to vote and then lost it again and then restored it again later. So that's an interesting sideline. Yes, I think we can look at this as Twain's testimony to his love for his wife. However, I think that he was trying to create great comedy and good art that would have a wide audience when he wrote this. I really think that he was hoping that this would have a big audience. He needed the money. Frankly, he needed the money. as one of you pointed out, Twain was not a good manager of the money he had made. And so Olivia had a good deal to handle with the different ups and downs of their fortunes as he tried to invest in different things. Let me give you one little incident about that. When Huckleberry Finn first came out, it was going to come out right about Christmas time because it was thought that the publisher thought that would give it a much bigger audience if it came out about Christmas time. Shortly before Christmas, Twain first saw the illustrations in Huckleberry Finn that the publisher had arranged for and put in. Twain had not had any input into the derivation of the illustrations. Well, when he saw those illustrations, he was horrified. He hated them. They were the stock vaudeville type images of blacks, and he didn't want the black figures portrayed that way. The same objections we have today to seeing old-fashioned kind of stereotyped images of blacks, Twain hated, and he tried to stop. He did stop the publication because he owned the publishing house. He did own the publishing house. So he held it past Christmas in order to change the illustrations of Huckleberry Finn in order to improve the representation of the black figures. The same thing happened to Frederick Douglass when his third autobiography came out in 1880, about 1882. He hated the illustrations. They were demeaning, stereotypical illustrations of black figures that he just abhorred, and he tried to stop the publication. But he didn't own the publishing house. So he was forced to have that autobiography published with illustrations that he disapproved of and didn't want. So I'm sure that these illustrations of Eve's diary were pleasing to Twain. I'm sure that he would have had control over that because it was important to him to do that. And I do think the illustrations added a great deal. I don't actually know whether this particular book did realize his hopes of having a good income from the sales of Eve's diary, but I do think the illustrations would have helped that to happen for several reasons.
I think the illustrations by Michael Moore were very nice in the edition we got though too.
Yes. They stand on their own really as art, but they also fit together to tell the story, to really pick up the mood of each passage that is being illustrated there. And it almost seems as though either he or someone had chosen the passages that would be represented in each illustration, like Eve with the stars and so forth. Actually, Eve's discovery of fire could be a play on the Prometheus myth, since Prometheus is the old Greek figure who steals fire from the gods, but Eve just stumbles upon it. Now, did you notice why Adam ate the apple? He just says, I was hungry. And I find that it's very hard to hold on to your principles when you're just too hungry. So that's a laugh line, but it's also sort of, it has a kernel of truth that has a zing to it as a discovery. And Twain would be pointing at all those moralists who expect poor people to follow all their religious precepts before they would ever be entitled to any help, and other social issues. In the early 1900s, we forget sometimes by 1904 how prosperous the United States was in its middle and upper middle classes, which had certainly developed by that time. The house that I live in now was built in 1906 in Holland, and the woodwork and the trim and the features in that house just bespeak the sense of quality that by that time just a prosperous middle-class person in Holland, Michigan was going to have. Just absolutely amazing. What are the features of the original house there when only 50 years before people were living in log cabins and shacks and little things that had been put up? It's hard for us to, our lives move so fast in terms of technology where we can remember dial phones and times when you had, such limited access to the technology that we do today. But the development of the signs of wealth and the prosperity and hopes of the middle and upper middle classes by 1904 is quite amazing to look at, both in the history of Holland, Michigan, and just the things that we know about that period before World War I. So Twain has a world of entertainment and a world of people's sophistication in terms of what they could read and their access to different shows and comic performances that he would have had by this period. There was a lot of competition. There wasn't like on the wild frontier where if you had just someone traveling around occasionally telling a few stories and getting a few laughs, that satisfied everyone's tastes. He was part of a bigger world of theater and comedy and literature as a whole. How well do you think the Diary of Eve is going to carry into the future? Can you imagine men and women 50 years from now still getting a lift and a laugh out of the Diary of Adam and Eve?
I think it speaks to all time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly has an elemental quality. And actually, I think the illustrations, the way they're done in black and white, gives a kind of universal of course, the figures look white because they're done in white, but the whole thing is in black and white. So, but I believe that the art of it achieves a universal feeling and quality. And I think that the characteristics of men and women that are portrayed in here would translate across cultures, might translate across cultures. Or do you think it only is in the English and American tradition?
I think, the story has part of its meaning to me comes from my familiarity with the Genesis story. Sadly, my grandkids have no familiarity with that story. So I don't know how that plays out in the future.
That's a good point. That is a good point. Twain could rely on most people having some acquaintance of what the story of Adam and Eve was. Although sometimes we exaggerate in our minds the degree to which everybody was familiar with the Bible. I mean, that may not be as true as we think that it is. So yes and no on that. But yes, if we come to a time where the knowledge of anything from the Bible is so dim and so minimal that it just doesn't have that resonance anymore, I think probably Twain's work does lose a lot if a person has absolutely no idea of the biblical story. But on the other hand, to me, the story is only a jumping off point that you probably can, a teacher or someone who would introduce the story can sort of tell the story of Adam and Eve in about 2 minutes. I mean, it's not a big long story in chapter 2 of Genesis. it is possible to create an awareness of the kernel of it just in a few words. And modern literature is still growing from the seeds of all of the Greek myths. You still see novels come out that are retelling a story of a Greek myth or picking up on a folk tale that we know. The folk tales will still be with us in 50 and 100 years. So yes and no, but some of the comic elements that we see in Twain and that we pointed to in the Bible and saw in Shakespeare and saw in Milton seem to me so universal that they will apply in future generations. They will be seen and recognized, at least in any culture that's been influenced by the English and Western tradition at all. I wonder if the works of Mark Twain can be read in foreign places and appreciated for what they are in foreign places. And I think that the answer would be yes, but I don't know.
Well, he traveled a lot to Europe to do all kinds of things. And I actually read a thing when he traveled in Germany. He did a diary of his travels there and what that was like. So I think he did a lot of travel himself. So I think he was appreciated kind of around the world. I don't know if he went to Asia or not, but I certainly know he was in Europe quite a bit.
Yes, he was. And he went over big in Europe. He was very popular in Europe. He would have done all that traveling if he didn't have the bookings in Europe. And that's true. He also did some hilarious pieces on the habit of Americans of going over to Italy and oohing and eyeing about every statue and every painting and just getting carried away with their pretentious admiration of great art. And you were supposed to be, you know, he sort of would do a takeoff on pretending that all Americans are really dilettantes when it comes to French art or Italian sculpture and so forth, and making fun of American tourists who at that time were flocking to Europe in order to get their in order to see the great paintings, pointing out that many of the paintings had doors and windows cut right through the painting, and what was so great about just standing there looking at this thing. So it was I think one of his books is called Innocents Abroad, and taking off on that idea. Yeah. So he can be good at poking fun at the American culture, which is sort of a national pastime. In poking fun at Americans is a pastime all over the world, isn't it? Especially if the Americans are the up and coming people who are all over the world and they've got all this money and they're running around and how many of you know the image of the ugly American, what's called the ugly American traveling around the world? Way too much money and way too little politeness or awareness of other cultures, and always assuming that they, you know, that they will be admired. So the presence of Americans around the world gives other parts of the world a tremendous familiarity that can sometimes be surprising. My husband, John DeVelder, had grown up on the mission field in China. And so we several times visited China, and particularly Xiamen, otherwise called Amoy, where his family had been missionaries for generations. So at one point we were going there, and I had an opportunity through some of them to give a talk at the University of Xiamen about Frederick Douglass, because that's what I had studied in graduate school. So who would expect Chinese students who are specializing in American literature to know so much about Frederick Douglass that they would put to shame 90% of American college students? I mean, what they knew about Douglass and what they had studied in American literature was pretty impressive for being in Shaman and just meeting these students. They were fascinated with the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which is a relatively simple book written in the 1847, and some of you know it. But their curiosity, their knowledge of the English that would be expected, and yes, they were graduate students, so they were like creme de la creme of the Chinese students. But Chinese
Also,
today are reading a lot of American literature. They're reading, you'd be surprised how common it is for English to be taught in Chinese schools. And most of the people who are getting ahead somewhat in China, many of them would like to have their children come to college in the United States. And so the curiosity and the involvement in trying to learn is definitely there. Wally, you were going to say something.
yes, because I came from Hong Kong, so I know what you're talking about. The Americans always been looked upon by the Chinese as a very favorable ally until the last 4 years. Things have changed. So therefore, I think what you have read about and your experience in Amoy is very common. Amoy is a seaport. Therefore, it was probably a former colony. I think the British and the Germans occupied that area. So there was a lot of Western influence. Many of the sea cities along the China coast were products of colonialization of the Chinese nation. Hong Kong was a British colony. Macau, Portuguese. Tianjin was German, Russian. So there's a lot of exploitation of the Chinese by these foreign nations, especially Europeans and Russians.
Yep.
American were looked upon as more favorable than the other foreign nations because America did not openly steal like the other nations and exploit the natives.
Good comments, good comments. And so John had an awareness of that, and we encountered that as well in going back to Shaman to see how it looks today, and the great interest and curiosity and emphasis in China, because we're going to both be world, they're going to be a world power during the rest of our lifetimes, and the economy is absolutely gigantic. So there's both a necessary and a cultural desire to be more connected and to understand better. So that gives them. But I learned that we're out of time now, but this is a very interesting area that you just brought up about the translatability of some of these works of American literature to give another culture a picture of what American literature represents and what some of the essential American characteristics might be that are not just coming to another place looking for money advantages and exploitation.
Linda, you have a couple of questions in the chat, and I was wondering if I can email them to you, and maybe we kick off the final session answering those questions. Or should I address them now? I just want to respect everyone's time. It is 2:34.
I think we should maybe hold them for next time.
Okay.
And
I'll go ahead and email them to you. And so if you put a question in the chat and it hasn't been answered, they'll go ahead and we'll answer it. Linda will answer it.
Or I can deal with it I think we probably should wind up because it's after 2:30 now and people have other commitments. So let's work with email. If people want to follow the answers to these questions, we'll circulate them on email or take them up later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much for the nice presentation. Sorry I was a little late.
Oh, you had to do a tutoring thing, so it was understandable that you couldn't quite make it at the very beginning. But we did start with looking at the illustrations that you had provided the link for us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wally. Thank you, Wally, for all your contributions to this.